Wie können deutsche Marken in China erfolgreich werden? Und welche Fallstricke lauern bei einer Produkteinführung im Reich der Mitte? Antworten auf Fragen wie diese bietet der Marketing Made in China Podcast mit Damian Maib und Thomas Derksen.
Herzlich willkommen zu unserem Podcast Marketing Made in China und zur ersten Folge in der Kategorie Englische Woche. Gerade bei dem Wort China bin ich schon ein bisschen verwirrt, weil wir nämlich heute auf Englisch sprechen werden. Normally we conduct this podcast in German for German listeners, but we became aware that there are so many interesting potential English-speaking interview partners, and it is why we decided to introduce the Englische Woche, a term our German listeners know from the world of soccer or football. So there's also a conflict. I don't know what to say, soccer or football, but you just use whatever you like. Once a month, beginning from now, we will have an English-speaking guest, and I'm sure it will be a lot of fun when two guys from Germany, from the Rhineland, talk in our Denglish with their guests, because we are not perfect, our English is not perfect, but I think it's no problem to communicate with our guests. And we are very delighted to have Mattie Bekink as our first English-speaking guest here today. Mattie also lives in Shanghai, but we cannot be together now, so we are all in our houses, still in lockdown. And she is China Director of the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Welcome to the podcast, Mattie.
Thank you, Thomas. It's really a pleasure to be with you and Damien, and especially I had not realized that I am the first English-speaking guest, so what an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mattie, for coming by. And well, I must say you have a really impressive CV. You studied at Stanford, and you are now the China Director of the Economist Intelligence Network. It sounds super cool, like the CIA or something. So really, really nice. In the beginning, we always love to hear the China story of our interview partners. So could you please tell us a little bit what brought you here and why you are in Shanghai now?
Thank you for the question. So, we're not quite as exciting as the CIA, but close. But I'll get to that in a moment. So for me personally, I never really made the choice to come to China on my own. I first moved to China in 1993 with my family. I was then a high school student. So I did high school in Beijing. I'm a graduate of the International School of Beijing from a long time ago. And it was my father's position that brought us over. So my father had actually learned Chinese in Taiwan in the 1970s, obviously when the mainland remained closed. And he did so at a time when everyone told him he was crazy for learning Chinese, that Japanese was the language of the future. But he also did so not really because he had, great professional ambitions or business foresight, but more for kind of personal or romantic reasons. He would tell you that he was quite interested in Tao Te Ching and Taoism, and he wanted to read the text in the original. So fast forward 20 years, the early 90s, it was a time when a lot of international companies were starting to really look to come to the Chinese market. And they were interested in any foreign executives who spoke even a little bit of Chinese and had some degree of business sense to help open the market to them. So he was sent over with a machine tool company that actually has lots of German roots, Ingersoll Rand, to open the Chinese market for that particular machine tool company. And so it was a remarkable adventure for us as a family, and in some ways the great privilege and blessing of my life to have come to China at a very young age. Relatively, I was 14. But, I sometimes joke that it felt as though I was a teenager at the same time that China was kind of emerging more on the world stage. And we were both kind of like gangly, long-limbed, finding our way in a very new set of circumstances. And there was a lot of joy, I would say, in China those days, and a lot of adventure, particularly because the foreign community and the international community, although in the beginning there was still quite an effort to keep us separate. We had a separate currency that we had to use as foreigners. There were very strict controls on where we could live, etc. There was a lot of mutual fascination, and it was quite a playful time to have come to the country. Interestingly, of my family and my siblings, I'm the one who really kind of engaged with China then moving forward. So I deferred going to university by a year. So I did a year at a university in China to kind of try and escape the expat bubble and have a more authentic experience, and then have, made it a point in my professional life to remain engaged and come back, the coda to this narrative arc, I suppose, is coming back to China with my own children in December of 2020, which was a very complicated time to come back with the pandemic. I met my husband in China. We got married in China. We left in 2012 and we're then living in Europe, first Italy and then the Netherlands. And in about 2019, we started to have that, it's been a while. I'd come back for work, but we were no longer living in China. And we decided to start exploring opportunities. Of course, that process took longer than anticipated with COVID and, finding the right position. And then our departure was much delayed. But we finally made it back and have been in Shanghai since.
Great. So now the question is, you already mentioned it's not as cool as the CIA, but can you briefly tell us what you are doing as a China director at the EIU?
Sure. So I am China director of the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network. We sit within the EIU. The best way to think of the Economist Group is, we all share the same mission, but the better known piece of the business is, of course, the newspaper, The Economist. And the Economist Intelligence piece of the business, we are kind of the research and analytical arm of the group. And the corporate network that I run for Greater China, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, we leverage the collective intelligence of the Economist Group to support business leaders on the ground in kind of the world's most exciting market. So therefore, of course, China. And we do that through a variety of content curation, programming, briefings, and other offerings. So it's a membership-based service. And we operate in those 3 cities and then in other cities across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Candidly, for me, it's always fascinating and humbling and exciting to try and, keep abreast of everything that's happening in China, as you know, and, work with our analysts and our forecasting teams to help, the leaders of businesses here on the ground, understand the market and also hear from them, what the operational realities are, and then have this kind of synergistic relationship with our analysts to help guide them. Not guide them, that's too big of a word, but they're always curious to know, what the lived experience of people running the businesses here on the ground in China is, because the data can tell you so much. But as you both know, kind of the reality of operating at China speed and this very dynamic, evolving environment means that there's never a dull moment.
So you were talking about the blessings living here in China as a 14-year-old girl. And these days, like the last few weeks, not a lot of people think it's a big blessing to live in Shanghai. The opposite is the case. A lot of people are fleeing Shanghai. So how are you doing during the lockdown in Shanghai now? Do you have enough supplies? I mean, we're now in lockdown for almost a month, or some people more than a month. How is your personal situation?
Thank you for asking. I think it's for those outside of Shanghai at the moment, I think it's always important to note that that's the first question we ask when we speak to colleagues or friends. Like, do you have enough food? How are you? Like, can I support you? It's really been a surreal experience. This is a city that you would agree 2 months ago, you couldn't walk for 500 meters without stumbling across an oat milk latte or some very trendy boutique selling hip clothes. And now, we're in the place where I've traded a slab of pork to get imported milk for my children. And, we're in an okay situation now at home. The food insecurity was quite stressful, especially because I have, young children. And that now it's more just, I don't know how it feels for you, but I think the uncertainty is really a drag, right? You never know exactly what you're going to get, when you're going to get it. You have very little control over even what you eat. And then that's compounded by the lack of control over this situation, which feels increasingly kind of absurd and feels, I would say, endless and relentless. There doesn't seem to be an exit in sight. In my community, and I live in an old lane house, it has really changed the dynamics of our community. And that's one kind of, I guess, beautiful note in all of this. We have a nursing home in our community and a lot of elderly and vulnerable people, and we've really rallied around to support them. So I've been able to share a lot of food with neighbors. But it's also, the senseless suffering is really hard to see when people have actually been hungry or very food insecure and are kind of moved almost to tears by some dirty potatoes. It doesn't feel like the dynamic cosmopolitan city that we know, the economic powerhouse of Shanghai. And so of China, excuse me. So Shanghai at this kind of standstill, the longer it goes on, the more surreal it feels.
Yes, indeed. It is a very challenging situation for all of us. And as you said, there's no direct kind of a hope when it will end, right? That doesn't make it better. And how do you think will the lockdown and the pandemic measures influence China's and Shanghai's reputation abroad, so in the rest of the world? And a lot of foreigners we see have fled the country already, and Thomas and we personally feel the city might have lost a little bit of its appeal to foreigners over the last couple of weeks. Will it be harder for foreign companies to find people who are willing to live and work in China as a foreigner? What do you think, Matti?
It's an excellent question. Anecdotally, and speaking with some of our member companies, that had already been a challenge because, the borders have been closed already for 2 years plus, right? So even before this very extreme lockdown that we're living through, I certainly know, friends, professional acquaintances who've been in China for an extremely long time and left last summer or are planning to leave this summer, because they kind of had enough with the COVID restrictions. And it's not so much that they were frustrated with China, but it's more if they had aging parents and they couldn't feel like they could easily get back and forth. If you live as an expat anywhere in the world, yes, you're happy to be part of the country in which you're living, but you still have a home somewhere else. And so I've certainly seen people who've been here 15, 17, 20 years suddenly deciding to go. That has been accelerated, I would say, under this lockdown. Or people who were planning to leave for the summer who've decided, actually, I'm just leaving. I think it's really tragic for Shanghai and for China, because I do think that, Shanghai's always been this industrious, international kind of open city. It's why it's been such a hub of global trade. I mean, it still is now. It has one of the busiest ports in the world. The Shanghai port accounts for 3% of global cargo throughput. I mean, it's a consequential place economically, but it's also been a vibrant cultural hotspot, kind of, because of the diversity of people here. I do think that, the longer that these types of restrictions remain in place for China, the closed borders, but also the rolling lockdowns and the restricted the restrictions that we'll continue to live with even after we get released from our homes. I don't think we're going to be released to anything that resembles kind of quote unquote normal life. I think that's going to be harder for foreigners who have the option to be elsewhere to accept. That said, there are always still going to be people who are excited to come back to be in China or to come back to China. And so, companies will have to, if they want foreign talent, look for those people, but it might be a more daunting proposition. And my hope is over the long term that, Shanghai's shine will return, that, we will recover from this and the city will kind of regain the spirit and energy that it's always had.
So the thing is always when talking about some diseases or viruses that we are not experts on this, right? So, but a lot of people on the internet, they think they are and they think they know how to do it right. So, but I always think if I would be in a leadership position or in an authority position, what should I do if I would be the Chinese authorities? Because when you go to a Chinese hospital on normal days when there's no pandemic, they're overcrowded. There are so many people. So there's always this concern saying like, if we just live with the virus, if we just let everyone get infected, that the Chinese hospitals will be overwhelmed with all the patients, because even it's just like 1 or 2 or 3% who have like severe symptoms with COVID, but still 1 or 2% in China is a huge difference to 1 or 2% in Germany or in Europe, right? So I'm always wondering, like, is there, can we have a little bit of understanding, like say, okay, even though a lot of measures in daily life are crazy and nobody would support them, but the thinking behind the measures, is it something you can understand why they act like they act now?
Sure. So it's a great question. And, again, I'm not an epidemiologist or a doctor, but as we've seen through governments throughout the world, the reality of the response to the pandemic is that public health and the economy are two sides of the same coin, right? So the responses that we've seen everywhere are governments trying to make policy choices with incomplete information in trying to strike the right balance between the economy and public health. The thing that feels strange for what we're living through in Shanghai right now is it feels as though we're using 2020 tools of these extreme lockdowns to control a 2022 virus, because by all accounts, Omicron is far less deadly and far less severe than the initial virus or even than Delta. However, for China, it remains a great threat, and here's why. If you look at the data out of South Korea and out of Hong Kong, which, like China, essentially had zero COVID in 2021. So they were both kind of had no natural immunity through infection in those countries. South Korea, however, had a very successful vaccine rollout, particularly among its elderly population. Hong Kong did not. And we know the tragedy of Hong Kong, a very high death rate among the elderly. And so what that indicates is that for Omicron, if you are elderly or have an underlying condition that makes you vulnerable to the virus, Omicron remains deadly. China, in contrast to a lot of other countries, particularly in Europe, where the vaccine was rolled out first among the elderly population and then only became eligible to younger people later on. They started vaccinating the elderly and vulnerable and then moved through the population. China, from the outset, focused on its overall vaccination rate, which stands at quite impressive 88% for the country. However, if you look then among elderly populations, in particular also here in Shanghai, for the over 80s, I believe it's less than half. For over 60s, it's, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's still a significant proportion of the population either has not been vaccinated or has only received one dose. And with the Chinese vaccines, the data also suggests that you need at least 3 doses to be effective against protecting against serious illness in Omicron. So I'm sorry, this is the reality of being from home. Didi Mama's talking. Can you just wait a second? Okay, here. Sorry.
No worries. If it's an important emergency,
hopefully you can edit that out. No, so
maybe we will keep it because this is the reality of home offices, right?
It is the reality of home office.
For the ones we can see Mattie on video, and there was like a small hand coming in and asking something very important for Mama.
Yes, well, it's better than when I've been interrupted to go take a COVID test. But the other piece of it, and I'm glad you talked about the percentage of the population who actually end up in the hospital and needing serious treatment, is that China's healthcare system is not at all equipped to handle a real outbreak. You certainly saw that in Wuhan when the virus first hit, where you had people literally dying on the streets outside the hospital. And the number of ICU beds that China has per 100,000 people in comparison with Germany is about 1/10. And we've already seen in Europe and in Germany, like the stress that was placed on the medical system and the healthcare system with outbreaks, even after vaccination. And so China, would very quickly have its healthcare system overrun. Shanghai has, we're kind of immune from it a little bit because we have probably the best healthcare infrastructure in the country here in Shanghai, but for many places, they simply wouldn't have the capacity. And then the final piece of it, of course, is that China really has said that we will put the people first. We will protect the people at all costs. They will be the priority. And that has meant no low death rate, limited exposure, and it's extremely hard for them to pivot away from this at that, at any point. There remains generally among the Chinese population, surveys, insofar as you can do surveys, suggest that there's still a great deal of fear around the virus. That was something that was had been around from the beginning, and that hasn't really changed with Omicron. There are pockets of people, I think, especially in Shanghai, who are getting frustrated and are trying to say it's not so bad. Look, the death rate in Shanghai is very low. Hey, maybe it's time to reconsider. But the other piece, too, is I think people in Shanghai are especially more willing to question whether it's more political than public health concerns that are driving the policy at this point. It's a very consequential year for China with a 20th Party Congress this autumn and the President Xi Jinping likely being reinstated for a third term. So the zero COVID policy was seen as a tool to kind of ensure social and, political and economic stability leading up to that very important moment. I think the real question, though, is whether it will continue to promote social and economic stability. It's certainly wreaking havoc on the economy, and we're seeing the strain on kind of the social fabric here in Shanghai. And Shanghai is not the only city locked down. The last time I checked, I think it was 87 of China's largest 100 cities have some form of lockdown or restriction in place.
So what are your personal plans? Do you plan to stay here in Shanghai with your children, or are you planning to leave? Because I don't have any children, but I have pets at home, and I'm quite worried about their safety here, because you see a lot of horror stories online and videos. And everyone is thinking about, like, will the next 6 months, year or 2 year, up to 2 years, will it be safe for me, my children, my pets here in Shanghai?
Yeah. So we had already planned to go for the summer to see family. We have now moved forward our departure date to the end of May. Honestly, if we did not have pets, it might have been earlier, but we had hoped that there would be enough opening between now or when we made these plans 2 weeks ago and the end of May, that we, our helper, our IE could come and, live with the pets. And now I don't think that's likely. So we are considering moving forward our departure even further. And the neighbors that we've now become closer to because of the pandemic had said they would look after our pets for us. That's very difficult, I think, for me professionally in some sense. I really don't want to feel like I'm leaving my team, and we're committed to coming back. We have a return flight for August to do our 21 days quarantine before school starts, but it's being locked in our homes is especially challenging for the children, and I think online learning is also not ideal for young children. So we would take them home to Amsterdam, and they would be able to go back to a local Dutch school and resume, learning in person for some time before the summer. So that's our plan. We are hoping and committed to, staying in China. We don't want to leave, but we will probably take a slightly longer summer holiday than intended. Ironically, despite the time difference, I kind of feel as though I might be able to work better from Amsterdam than Shanghai, because I won't have interruptions like the one we just saw if the kids can go to school. I can actually just, focus on this conversation or whatever piece of work I'm trying to do without constantly worrying, what's happening at home. So, that's our plan at least.
Yeah, very, very much understandable. I think, Thomas, you're also planning, right, to go over the summer, and I would also like to do that. Haven't booked flights yet, but I hope it will be possible for all of us. And now you have been living and visiting Shanghai over the last couple of decades. So since you've been 14, you said, so that's quite a long time. The city, the country has growing, and you have been growing with it. Besides the massive modernization and changes, what would you say has kind of remained the same? Is there anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me on a personal level, moving back to China this time around, I mean, I still remember when I landed in Beijing with my parents and my sisters in 1993. We were the expressway to the old airport had just been built, but it wasn't open. So we were on a dirt road stuck behind a donkey cart trying to get to our home, our new home. And, it couldn't be more contrasted with the experience that my children had arriving, of course, mid-COVID, right, into the gleaming kind of glory of the Pudong International Airport, and then the kind of surreal but very efficient process of all the testing and everything. Of course, they'd been in China for 2 weeks and had only been in quarantine. So at some point they were doing a video call with their grandparents and sort of said, "How is it?" They said, "We have no idea. All we see is the inside of this room." But so there has been a lot of progress. When we finally were released from quarantine, I remember going on a run in a park near our home in Shanghai, in Zhongshan Park. And there's something about China in the early mornings that it just is very grounding on a personal level. And that's where you kind of see this continuity of, of the people, people doing their morning exercises, old men walking their birds, the smell of jianbing, these very kind of, I think, visceral cultural reminders of the shared tradition and kind of the glory of, the longstanding tradition of Chinese culture and what it has to offer. So, I think that's certainly endures, and you can find that. I think, the way in which people think about China and engage with China has also changed. It is, when we first moved in the early 90s, as I said, it was a very playful time. But it was really kind of, the rest of the world coming in to, in some ways kind of show China what modern economy and a modern economy could be. Now it's very much, either the opposite. The rest of the world is very dependent on the Chinese market for growth or for new opportunities. And there's much more of an exchange and a give and take. And then we've also seen, over the last few years, kind of different ways of innovation developed in China. If you think about kind of the commercial brands that came in the 90s and were kind of introducing, the kind of commercial concepts coming off of, the disruption of the decades prior. Now China leapfrogged the entire world in terms of e-commerce and the ways in which we consume and find out about new commercial products. And it's actually hard for foreign brands to keep up because they can have their entire product line disrupted through innovation in ways that they couldn't even conceive about in headquarters in Europe or the US, where, if you're going to bring a new product to the market, you first come up with some designs, and maybe you do some study or like research, then you kind of iterate further, and like 18 months between when you had the first idea and when the final product hits the market. Whereas, Chinese young disruptive brands, they just throw something out there, and in conversation with consumers on social media, they iterate their product in real time. And so if you're doing the old model, the 18 months by the time you hit the market, like that, whatever the trend is completely gone, or it's kind of evolved into something else because your young Chinese upstart company has, evolve the product while it's already sitting on the shelves in consultation with the consumers, which they love because then they feel that they're part of it. And then they're building brand loyalty. And I'm not at all like a consumer goods or marketing expert, so there's probably a better way to describe that phenomenon. But I think there's been a lot of exciting change in China in these decades as well.
So Shanghai is without a question an economic powerhouse, right? And it's a very important city for China. But we also talked about maybe the port of Shanghai, the financial district here in Shanghai. So in your opinion, so what extent has Shanghai and other mega cities in China like Shenzhen or Guangzhou, Beijing, maybe a little bit, taken the place of Hong Kong as an economical hub of high international importance? Because now the lockdown here in Shanghai and the economic consequences also have consequences for the whole world. And we can see that newspapers, they also write about it. So what's in your point of view? Like, how important is Shanghai now for China and for the whole world?
Yeah. So China is hugely important. Shanghai, is hugely important to China's economy, and the lockdown is really rocking China's economy. We haven't really seen the figures yet because the Q1 GDP growth data that was released the week before last week didn't really reflect the lockdowns because, that's really, we're going to see that data more from April. But, as I mentioned, the port is consequential. Shanghai also has China's largest stock exchange. So leaving aside the disruption to kind of local retail, manufacturing, and financial sectors, which, is quite considerable, the lockdowns has really disrupted regional supply chains, local supply chains, of course, but regional, and, is adding to global inflationary pressures. We're not even seeing yet all of this borne out because the ships, for example, that are arriving in Europe now left before the lockdowns. So in May, June, that's when, the ships with less cargo will start hitting European ports, and we'll start seeing the broader global disruption. Inflation was already a problem globally, but before all of this, but we've started to see it now trickle more in China. And these increased inefficiencies and costs of doing business in China will add to those pressures. And then finally, I think the piece to understand about the supply chain disruptions is a lot of the disruptions are not at the port. Vessels are still able to move in and out of the port. The problem is getting either goods to the port or even getting supplies to the factories to produce goods. A lot of expressways have been closed. There are differing, requirements and restrictions on lorries and lorry drivers across different provinces. So if you're looking at the Yangtze River Delta, which is kind of the industrial and manufacturing beating heart of China, you really are seeing a huge amount of disruption that is also volatile, that changes quite often in response to, the COVID situation. There's a lot of pressure on local and municipal and provincial level governments to, contain COVID and not have any outbreaks. And so they tend to be overly zealous in, trying to protect the communities from COVID. But that means that, supplies can't get to the factories, goods can't get out. And even here in Shanghai, when the government released the kind of white list of companies that were supposed to resume operations, the European Chamber and I and others who've been talking to a lot of companies, they're still operating at a fraction of their capabilities, depending on who you're talking to, somewhere between 10 to 30, 40% capacity. And that's, again, because they can't get the supplies that they need, or they can't get the workforce that they need to actually be available to work. So I do think we're going to see a great deal of continued disruption, and that it won't really be felt in the rest of the world for another month or so, but that it's going to definitely be a drag, not just on China's growth this year, but on global growth.
And in the beginning, you said something very important. You and the network, you help leaders of businesses to make the right decisions in and with China. So now it happens that Thomas and myself, we're also leaders of our businesses, though not yet multinational corporations or stock listed. Not yet, but maybe soon, let's see. But what would you kind of advise us? Now we are in the e-commerce industry and social media marketing. We are selling products on Tmall, JD, and other platforms. To what extent would you suggest us to make a downward adjustments towards expected revenues in 2022 due to lockdowns and delivery shortages? And maybe what kind of measures could we take to smoothen out these effects? For example, having multiple warehouses in place, etc. What do you think, Matti? What would be your advice?
Well, so Damien, if I really knew the answer to that, I would quit my job and go put money in whatever the answer was. No.
So you would make a lot of money.
Exactly, right? I would open a separate consulting shop. And I should also clarify that we don't really give business advice. What we do is present data and facts, because your businesses better than we ever can. But what I can say is, yes, expect continued disruptions and volatility through at least all of 2022. It's been very clear that at the moment there's no plan to deviate from the dynamic zero COVID approach, and that means continuing restrictions and lockdowns and then business disruptions. The challenge for any person trying to run a business in China, whether they're a very large multinational corporation, publicly listed, or a small startup, is you can't do effective business planning in an on-off economy if you don't know from literally one day to the next what the operating reality will be on the ground. So in terms of, planning for that kind of volatility and, thinking about, okay, what is my new concept of risk resilience? I know these risks are there. How can I be resilient to them? I think multiple warehouses is probably one option. We've certainly, even before this, there was some concern, especially around the timing of the trade war, of people who are looking for a China plus one strategy, moving some parts of their supply chain out of China so that if tensions became problematic, they had a kind of a backup plan. There was a lot more chatter about that than actual movement. We didn't actually see that many companies make that move because, honestly, one of the reasons China has become, such an attractive place for companies to set up their operations is because you can, have a full-scale program here where you have all of your suppliers in one place, and it's quite efficient. That is no longer the case because of these disruptions. So I would say, yes, it's going to be a tough year, a challenging year for China, and I think for most businesses operating in China. Of course, that does vary by industry. There might certainly be some bright spots, but I would anticipate that, through this year, we're going to continue to see the disruptions. We're also going to see a lot of volatility in energy and commodities prices, not just because of what's happening in China. That's really more related to the Ukraine war, and global inflationary pressures will continue. There's still going to also be downward pressure on the renminbi. There's a whole, suite of challenges for business, not just in China, but perhaps especially in China at the moment.
A lot of our listeners demand that we have more women on our podcast, so we are very happy to have you here. And you make also a lot of research on diversity and empowering women. When I took a look on your LinkedIn profile, this is a topic that really is important to you. Do you see a difference between China and the West when it comes to women's role in society? Last time we talked to another journalist from Europe, and she said she met a lot of very capable and very strong Chinese female business leaders. And but at the same time, I feel there's not a lot of debating about gender and feminism, diversity in China. Are the Chinese people are just doing it instead of discussing about it? Or how do you feel as a woman and having a look at from the outside to the Chinese society when it comes to women and empowering women?
It's an excellent question, and thank you for raising it. So, I think it's interesting to look at kind of feminism and the role of women in China. One thing that, there's a lot that he got wrong, but one thing Mao may or may not have gotten right was kind of promoting the idea that, women hold up half the sky, 女人能顶大半天, right? And also kind of by kind of asexualizing the population. Everybody wore the same clothes. Women were expected to work alongside men in roles that were traditionally more masculine. That really, the foundation of the People's Republic was one that had a sense of equality in which the distinctions between the genders were not what mattered. It was the distinctions between classes. So if you were a worker or a peasant, whether you were male or female, you were on the right side of history. Heaven help you if you were bourgeois or a landowner or an intellectual, right? But so it's not to say that that kind of shift or that revolution that we saw under Mao was all positive. It certainly was not. But in terms of the role of the genders, there was a much more focus on equality. And I think that has lingered on to some extent. There still remain challenges for women in China, but one anecdote that I'd like to share that I think illuminates how sometimes when we look at things with a Western lens, we miss some of the nuance. So I wrote my senior thesis on the ethics of China's one-child policy. And in some of my field research, going and talking to Chinese women, both at the All China Women's Federation and then through many other areas, they describe the policy in terms of liberation, that they didn't see it as limiting their human rights. That wasn't universally the case, but many women said, this has removed the pressure on me to keep having children until I have a boy. This has, it's muzzled my in-laws. Like pre this policy, my in-laws would have continued to want me to have more children. And again, have children until I have a boy. Now I can have one girl and there's nothing my in-laws can say about it. It also enables me to have a career because I'm not going to be spending that many years having children and caring for them, etc. That all said, so I thought that was just such an interesting part of that research that was, some of the language that was come out. Of course, there were, horrific problems with the one-child policy and how it was implemented, but it wasn't kind of universally for the women who, only had one child viewed as a negative. In fact, many of them saw it as, a way that they could have a more full life. I would also then say that what we've seen though now in China is there's still a lot of pressure, particularly on young women to, get married. Right now, of course, because of the demographic crisis, there's a huge pressure to have more children. China is trying to course correct on the number of children that families are having, and it's not so far going as well as you would think. And then the other piece that I think is interesting is like data-wise, over the last decade or so, we've actually seen a decline in the number of Chinese women in senior political positions and senior business leaders, which I'm not really sure why that is. Even though relative to other countries, China was in a pretty okay place, there's been starting to be a decline over the last 10 years. More recently, there's been some controversy in social media about kind of feminism going too far and things like that. I do think that the conversation exists in China. And, where we've seen some, just drawing on one of my other previous work experience, some really important and consequential work was, for example, around domestic violence, which was not until about 10, 15 years ago, was not actually acknowledged as an affirmative defense in instances where women, for example, killed their abusers. They couldn't use that as a defense. And we've seen so now you can, but that also was a slow process for China, and also educating judges about it. We also have seen, the focus on having a harmonious society has made it difficult sometimes for women to get divorced, even if there's abuse. And yes, abuse can happen both ways, but statistically, it's more likely that women are the victims in those cases. So you still kind of periodically see cases in the headlines that's there. That's true everywhere in the world. That's not violence and violence against women is a problem the world over. But the Chinese legal system has only within the last kind of decade and a half started to handle that in a better way. At the same time, the Chinese legal system overall is, only about 40 years old. So, it's not surprising that I always think it's important to note that it's in that regard, despite being, a very ancient and beautiful culture, some of the legal pieces of the legal infrastructure of the country are still fairly young. So overall, sorry, this is a very rambling answer, but it's a topic you can take in so many different directions. I do think you do see a lot of strong, powerful women, particularly in Shanghai. Shanghainese women are known for being kind of the most powerful in China, as, I think those of us here know, but for your listeners outside, it might be an interesting, noteworthy point. But, there still is, I think, a powerful conversation around the role of women and a women's movement in China for a reason.
Yeah, my wife is from Shanghai, so I know what you're talking about. And I think you made a very good point with developing laws here in China, because we are, if we see Shanghai, if we see Pudong, the financial district, the modern side of Shanghai, we sometimes forget that China in some cases and in some fields and in some places is still a developing country, right? So this is an important nuance that everyone should know, that it's still developing and there is still a lot of room for improvement.
Yes, very, very interesting insights to these questions, Mattie. And now we've also talked about some points that might raise criticism when it comes to China, its political system or society. What would be the things you say that the West, so that we can learn from China?
So it's a great question. I think whether you're talking about China and the West or, any culture or country learning from one another, the biggest, thing that we can all learn is to be open-minded and to be okay with discomfort. I think that that's something that in particular with the closed borders now and the lack of exchange, we're really missing. But to challenge ourselves to try and empathize and view things through another lens, I think is, the main thing that I always want people to do, sorry, that sounds too grandiose, that I would humbly suggest that when people look at China, they try to understand where China is coming from. For me, I think the industriousness of China, the capacity to kind of quickly problem solve, the willingness to, care about the collective. I mean, it sounds cliched, and it is cliched, but that's actually been, I think, the one, piece of beauty and hope that we've all seen in this pandemic, that, the people of Shanghai have really found ways to support one another, to innovate even from their living rooms to support their communities. And then I think, for me, I always marvel at how when I take the time to really engage, whether with it's one of my neighbors, one of my business contacts, and hear their life stories. I think we all are most driven by personal narrative. And this country has gone from an agrarian society to a global superpower in a matter of decades. And it's gone through tremendous pain and upheaval in achieving that, and also tremendous glory and joy. And almost anyone you talk to has family stories, personal stories, from the billionaire to the Kwai D delivery guy. There's just so much richness here. And I feel as though, particularly in kind of the public conversations around China that we mostly see in the West, the empathy is not there, the humanity is not there, but also the richness and the nuance is lost. So that's a very cliched answer, I'm afraid. But for me, on a personal level, that's what I always find most rewarding and inspiring and, humbling about living here and living in a place where people think and feel and might live differently than you do. But at the end of the day, we're all more alike than we're not. Although, to conclude on a kind of a humorous anecdote, when I was studying at the Foreign Affairs College, which is the training school for Chinese diplomats in Beijing, I was trying to express some of this to my classmates at the time. I was a very, precocious 18-year-old, like common humanity, we all kumbaya, whatever. And I used the expression, I was speaking Chinese, but I said, we are all red on the inside, talking about blood. But they thought I meant communism. And then, so it was just one of those moments where I was like, oh, no, not that red. No, never mind. So I guess yes, we're all red on the inside, but what kind of red? And so, but that's what I mean about kind of being open to exchange and really listening to one another. So thank you for listening to me so much today.
Thank you so much. And humor is always a good way to communicate, even if we don't speak the same language or have different ways of thinking, different ways of living. So we are very happy that we can end this episode on this positive note, and we are still optimistic. And if we are in this situation in Shanghai lockdown optimistic, so we think that, it's not the world's end, and we will survive, and we hope that Shanghai will come back stronger than it was before this crazy lockdown. Matti, thank you so much for your insights and for your opinion. It was really interesting, and we would be happy to maybe have you once again next time on our podcast.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure and a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, Matti. Very insightful, and see you soon.
Thanks. Let's stay hopeful.